Imagine a narrow mountain gorge where two rivers meet amid the dense forests of the Caucasus. Here, the sound of rushing water fills the air almost year-round, and warm mineral springs rise from deep within the earth. Today, this is one of the world's most celebrated spa destinations, Borjomi. But long before the first sanatoriums, the railway, and the famous green bottles, this valley was already a crossroads of cultures, trade routes, and armies. The story of Borjomi begins far earlier than the town itself. At an elevation of approximately 800 to 900 meters above sea level, Borjomi enjoys a mild mountain climate, a factor that would later prove instrumental in its development as a resort. Archaeological finds reveal that people inhabited this area as far back as the Bronze Age, over 3,000 years ago. In the vicinity of modern-day Borjomi, remnants of ancient settlements, fortifications, household items, and burial sites have been uncovered. Even then, the inhabitants made use of the valley's natural bounty: fertile lands, dense forests, and abundant freshwater springs. Yet what truly set this place apart were its extraordinary mineral springs. Modern scientists believe that the water now known as Borjomi is formed deep underground. It percolates through the volcanic rock of the Lesser Caucasus, absorbs natural minerals and carbon dioxide, and eventually rises to the surface under its own pressure. This process takes thousands of years. Of course, the ancient inhabitants knew nothing of geology, but they understood perfectly well that this water was different from ordinary spring water. Some historians suggest that the springs were used not only for drinking but also for healing. Though written records are scarce, archaeologists have discovered large numbers of ancient ceramic vessels around certain springs, evidence that people made regular pilgrimages to these sites. The name Borjomi itself appeared much later. Several theories exist regarding its origin. The most widely accepted links it to two Georgian words: Borj, meaning fortress, and Omi, meaning war. Thus, the name could be interpreted as fortress war or place of fortresses. Another version traces it to an ancient Georgian term for a fortified settlement. Historians have yet to reach a consensus. Interesting fact: over 200 archaeological sites from various eras from the Bronze Age to the late Middle Ages have been discovered in the Borjomi Gorge. During the Middle Ages, the territory of present-day Borjomi belonged to the historical region of Tori, one of southern Georgia's most important provinces. It was through these gorges that roads connecting the eastern and western parts of the country passed, making control over them a matter of immense strategic importance. Thus, fortresses began to rise across the region. Even today, the ruins of medieval fortifications can be seen around Borjomi, most notably the fortresses of Gogia and Petre. They formed part of an integrated defense system designed to protect the gorge from invasion. In medieval Georgia, fortresses were rarely built in isolation. They were positioned so that garrisons could relay signals to one another using beacons or smoke. In this way, news of an approaching enemy spread with remarkable speed. Imagine the scene nearly 1,000 years ago. On the mountain peaks stand stone fortresses. Below, the Kura River roars. Caravans of merchants pass along the road, and in times of danger, a signal fire flares up on one of the towers, visible within minutes from the next peak. Such was the face of this gorge long before the resort existed. But peace was not to last. From the 13th century onward, the Caucasus became a theater of relentless warfare. Armies of Mongols swept through the region, followed by the invasions of Tamerlane. Later, the influence of the Ottoman Empire and Persia grew stronger, and southern Georgia regularly became a battlefield between the two great powers of the region. Constant warfare drove many settlements into decline. The 16th century proved particularly devastating. Following the partition of Georgian lands between the Ottoman Empire and Persia, the Borjomi Gorge came under Ottoman influence. For centuries, these territories changed hands repeatedly. For the local population, this meant destroyed villages, dwindling trade, and gradual depopulation. Remarkably, it was precisely this turmoil that allowed the Borjomi Gorge to preserve its natural environment almost untouched. While Europe was deforesting on a massive scale, these mountain woodlands remained largely wild. The forests that surround Borjomi today are the descendants of those ancient Caucasian woodlands that have stood here for hundreds, even thousands of years. The turning point came only in the early 19th century. Following a series of Russo-Turkish wars, the Russian Empire gradually extended its control over most of present-day Georgia. In 1829, under the terms of the Treaty of Adrianople, the Ottoman Empire ceded part of the South Caucasus to Russia. From this moment, an entirely new chapter in Borjomi's history begins. Military engineers, officers, and doctors arriving in the region took note of the unusual mineral springs. According to one well-known account, garrison soldiers began drinking the local water regularly and noticed that it aided stomach and digestive ailments. These observations piqued the interest of military physicians. Soon, the water became the subject of early scientific studies. No one at the time could have foreseen that this small mountain settlement would, within a few decades, transform into one of the Russian Empire's most renowned resorts and eventually become a symbol of Georgia known around the world. It is from this point that the story of the Borjomi we recognize today truly begins. Interesting fact: the mineral water rises to the surface naturally, driven by underground pressure. Unlike many other mineral waters, it requires no pumping. At the dawn of the 19th century, the Borjomi Gorge remained a quiet, sparsely populated corner of the Caucasus, a scattering of small villages, dense forests, the rushing Kura River, and mineral springs known only to the locals. No one could have imagined that within a few decades, this place would become one of the most prestigious resorts in the Russian Empire. Everything changed after the Russo-Turkish War of 18,281,829. Under the Treaty of Adrianople, parts of the South Caucasus were ceded to Russia. Military garrisons were established, roads were built, and administrative centers sprang up across the region. It was the military who first took serious notice of the local springs. A popular story frequently retold in books about Borjomi tells of garrison soldiers who drank regularly from one of the springs and noticed its beneficial effects on stomach ailments. While the details cannot be verified, it is documented that by the early 1830s, military physicians had begun investigating the properties of the local water. Among the first to recognize Borjomi's potential was Major General Mikhail Tolstoy, commander of troops in the Akhaltsikhe district. According to surviving records, he sampled the water in 1834 and ordered the spring to be improved. One spring was later named Ekaterininsky in honor of his daughter, Catherine. Soon, other members of the Russian administration in the Caucasus took an interest in Borjomi. The real breakthrough came in the 1840s, when the Viceroy of the Caucasus, Prince Mikhail Vorontsov, turned his attention to developing the resort. Vorontsov is well known to historians. He played a pivotal role in the development of the Caucasus, building roads, fostering cities, agriculture, and resort infrastructure. He was the first to envision Borjomi not merely as a mineral spring, but as a European-class spa. On his orders, the first promenades were laid out around the springs, the grounds were landscaped, and bridges and roads were constructed. Soon after, the first bathhouses were built for mineral water treatments. It is hard to imagine today, but at that time, no town of Borjomi actually existed, just a few small settlements that gradually coalesced around the resort. The first visitors came not for leisure, but for healing. The 19th century witnessed a golden age of balneology, the science of healing with mineral waters. Resorts flourished across Europe. Karlovy Vary in Bohemia, Baden-Baden in Germany, Vichy in France. The Russian Empire sought a resort of comparable stature. Borjomi proved the ideal candidate. Its mild climate, dense coniferous forests, pure mountain air, and unique bicarbonate sodium mineral water made it exceptionally attractive. Physicians recommended it for ailments of the gastrointestinal tract, liver, metabolic disorders, and certain kidney conditions. It is worth noting that many 19th century recommendations have since been revised by modern medicine, yet even then, the water was regarded as among the most valuable in the empire. The resort's popularity grew so rapidly that hotels, boarding houses, and summer villas soon began to appear. The imperial family took a special interest in Borjomi. In the 1860s, members of the Romanov dynasty visited the resort on several occasions. And in the 1890s, Grand Duke George Alexandrovich Romanov, son of Emperor Alexander I and younger brother of the future Nicholas I, took up residence in Borjomi on his doctor's advice. George suffered from tuberculosis, and physicians believed the mountain climate might ease his condition. A luxurious Moorish-style palace was built for him in Borjomi, a residence that still stands today, now serving as the summer residence of the President of Georgia. Though the Grand Duke's health could not be fully restored, his presence further elevated the resort's prestige. Aristocracy was soon followed by wealthy industrialists, merchants, scholars, writers, and officers. By the late 19th century, Borjomi's summer population swelled severalfold. Thousands of holidaymakers descended on the town from across the empire each season. But a serious problem remained. Reaching Borjomi was exceedingly difficult. The journey from Tiflis modern-day to Tbilisi took several days along winding mountain roads. For a rapidly growing resort, this posed a major obstacle. The solution arrived in 1894 with the opening of the Kayseri-Borjomi railway line. This event was nothing short of revolutionary. The journey from Tiflis now took just a few hours. It was the railway that transformed Borjomi from a remote mountain settlement into an accessible resort. Soon, the first excursion routes appeared, along with gorge walks, musical evenings, restaurants, and theatrical performances. Borjomi was gradually becoming not only a place of healing but also a center of high society. It was during this period that the commercial bottling of mineral water began. Until the late 19th century, water was mostly drunk directly at the spring or transported in ceramic vessels and wooden barrels. This method was impractical. The water quickly lost its dissolved carbon dioxide, and transport was difficult and costly. In 1890, the first mineral water bottling plant was built at the resort. This marked a pivotal moment in Borjomi's history. Interesting fact: in the 19th century, doctors recommended drinking Borjomi water on a strict schedule in small portions, slowly, and always at the spring itself, believing that this was the only way to derive maximum benefit. Now, water could be sent not only to Tiflis or Batumi, but also to Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, Warsaw, and other cities across the Russian Empire. The first bottles were made of glass, varying in shape and size. Their appearance changed many times over the years. The familiar green bottle that became the brand's signature emerged much later in the 20th century, following several stages of production standardization. Demand grew at an astonishing pace. While early production numbered only tens of thousands of bottles, by the early 20th century millions were being filled annually. Borjomi had become one of the most famous mineral water brands in the Russian Empire. The town itself was transforming as well. Hotels, a post office, banks, shops, pharmacies, telegraph services, paved streets, and new bridges across the Kura appeared one after another. Before the railway, the journey from Tiflis took 2 to 3 days. After the line opened, just a few hours. This was what made Borjomi a truly mass-market resort. By the early 20th century, Borjomi already resembled a proper European spa, place where people came not only for treatment but for leisure, socializing, music, and the summer season. The future seemed to promise only prosperity. But within a few years, the familiar order of life would be upended by the First World War, revolutions, and the collapse of the Russian Empire. Borjomi was about to enter an entirely new era. When we hear the word Borjomi today, most people picture not a town but a bottle of mineral water with its distinctive green label. Few stop to consider that the story of this water began not decades or even centuries ago but hundreds of thousands of years ago, deep beneath the earth, long before humans ever walked the planet. To understand why Borjomi water is considered unique, we must look into the geological past of the Caucasus. Millions of years ago, the territory of what is now southern Georgia was far more volcanically active. Powerful tectonic forces shaped the mountain ranges of the Lesser Caucasus, and magma created an intricate network of fissures deep underground. It is precisely these processes that gave rise to the Borjomi deposit today. Rain and meltwater slowly seep through the rock to depths of around 8 to 10 kilometers. There, it is heated by the Earth's natural warmth, dissolves minerals, absorbs volcanic carbon dioxide, and driven by high natural pressure gradually rises back to the surface. This entire journey takes, according to geologists' estimates, anywhere from several thousand to tens of thousands of years. That is why the water you find in a bottle today cannot be artificially replicated. This is one reason Borjomi stands apart from many other mineral waters. Most such waters must be pumped up mechanically. At Borjomi, the water emerges on its own, driven by such powerful pressure that the springs flow naturally without any assistance. Experts describe the deposit as having its own natural head pressure. Remarkably, the temperature of the water as it leaves the ground remains almost constant, around 38 to 41 degrees Celsius. It emerges warm. If you taste it directly at the source, it is quite different from the familiar store-bought version, warmer, more heavily carbonated, and with a much more pronounced mineral flavor. Many tourists tasting Borjomi for the first time at the source express surprise. This is a completely different water. Indeed, after bottling, the water is cooled to preserve its stable composition and dissolved carbon dioxide. This raises an obvious question. If locals had known about the springs for centuries, why did industrial production only begin in the late 19th century? The answer lies in technology. Without the glass industry, railways, and modern hermetically sealed packaging, transporting mineral water was practically impossible. Within days of being filled, the water lost much of its natural carbon dioxide and with it, its distinctive taste and properties. For a long time, the primary cure was simply drinking the water directly at the source. The situation changed in 1890, when the first industrial bottling plant opened in Borjomi. For its time, it was a state-of-the-art facility. Bottles were carefully washed, sterilized, filled as quickly as possible after the water emerged, and sealed airtight. Even then, engineers understood that the shorter the time between source and bottle, the better the water's properties would be preserved. Interestingly, the first bottles bore little resemblance to today's. They varied in shape, glass color, and even volume. Some were clear, others dark green or brown. There was no unified brand design. The iconic green bottle with its recognizable silhouette did not yet exist. The brand identity now recognized by millions began to take shape much later in the 20th century, when mass production demanded a more distinctive and memorable image. By the early 20th century, Borjomi was already being sold far beyond the Caucasus. Bottles were shipped to Moscow, St. Petersburg, Warsaw, Kiev, Odessa, Baku, and countless other cities of the Russian Empire. For many affluent families, a bottle of Borjomi had become a staple of the home medicine cabinet. At the time, doctors prescribed it for stomach, intestinal, liver, and metabolic disorders. But it is important to note that 19th century medicine was very different from today's. Modern physicians recommend consuming medicinal mineral waters only when indicated, and in measured amounts they are not suitable for daily consumption by everyone. Nevertheless, it was precisely its reputation as a healing water that made Borjomi famous. Following the 1917 revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union, the brand's story took an unexpected turn. Whereas Borjomi had once been a drink of the aristocracy, in Soviet times it became a symbol of the state-run sanatorium system. The USSR actively expanded health resort treatment across the country. Sanatoriums, holiday homes, and prophylactic centers were built everywhere, and Borjomi became one of the Union's premier therapeutic resorts. Water production scaled to industrial levels. It was shipped to every Soviet republic from the Baltics to the Far East. By the mid-20th century, output had grown tenfold compared with the pre-revolutionary period. It was then, interestingly, that another tradition familiar to many former Soviet citizens took hold. Almost every Soviet family kept a bottle of Borjomi just in case. It was opened after heavy meals, during digestive troubles, or simply when ill. Over time, the brand name became so ubiquitous that the word Borjomi was often used generically to mean any medicinal mineral water. It was during the Soviet years that Borjomi gained global recognition. At international exhibitions, the mineral water received numerous awards, and exports gradually extended well beyond the USSR to Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Yet one curious fact remains little known. Despite vast production volumes, the source itself continues to function thanks to entirely natural processes. Geologists constantly monitor the water level and its rate of replenishment. That is why extraction volumes are strictly regulated. If water were extracted faster than the deposit could recharge, this unique natural system could be irreversibly damaged. Today, extraction is carried out under continuous state and scientific oversight. This ensures the deposit will endure for future generations. And here lies an intriguing paradox. The Borjomi brand is recognized by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Many buy the water every week. Yet only a fraction of them have ever set foot in the town of Borjomi itself. And yet, it is here amidst the dense forests, the murmuring Kura River, and the age-old parks that the story of one of the planet's most famous mineral waters begins. It is to this place that we will turn in the next chapter, to see how Borjomi survived revolutions, the Soviet Union, the collapse of the USSR, economic crisis, and managed to re-emerge as one of the most beautiful resorts in modern Georgia. At the turn of the 20th century, Borjomi stood at the height of its prosperity. A cozy resort surrounded by coniferous forests, it welcomed thousands of holidaymakers each summer. Aristocrats strolled along its manicured avenues, live music filled the restaurants, and trains arrived daily from Tiflis, Moscow, and St. Petersburg, bringing new guests. The future seemed to promise only further prosperity. But history had other plans. In 1914, the First World War broke out. The tourist flow dried up almost overnight. Hotels and boarding houses emptied, and many buildings were converted into hospitals for the wounded. The resort, so recently alive with visitors, gradually became a place to treat the casualties of war. 3 years later, the Russian Empire ceased to exist. The revolutions of 1917 fundamentally redrew the political map of the Caucasus. In 1918, the independent Democratic Republic of Georgia was proclaimed. It was during this period that Borjomi was officially granted town status. Until then, it had been a resort settlement steadily growing around the springs and railway station. But independence proved short-lived. In 1921, the Red Army entered Georgia, and the country became part of the Soviet Union. For Borjomi, this meant the beginning of a radically new era. While under the Russian Empire, the resort had been accessible mainly to the wealthy, the Soviet authorities now championed mass sanatorium treatment. The idea was that every worker had a right to rest and health recovery. A vast network of sanatoriums was established across the Soviet Union, and Borjomi became one of its principal hubs. New treatment blocks, sanatoriums, holiday homes, clinics, and prophylactic centers were built. Many were constructed in the style of Soviet modernism with spacious lobbies, large windows, and terraces overlooking the mountain slopes. Whereas in the late 19th century the visitors had been chiefly aristocrats, now engineers, teachers, doctors, factory workers, and military personnel could obtain vouchers to Borjomi. Of course, getting a place was not easy. Demand far outstripped supply, but for millions of Soviet citizens, a trip to Borjomi remained a cherished dream. Mineral water continued to play a central role in the town's life. During the Soviet years, production grew rapidly. The state invested considerable resources in expanding the plant and modernizing its equipment. By the 1960s and 1970s, hundreds of millions of bottles were being filled annually. Some estimates suggest that in its peak years, production exceeded 400 million bottles a year, making Borjomi one of the Soviet Union's most widely available mineral waters. But water alone was not the town's only claim to fame. Borjomi was also known for its exceptional climate. The town sits at an elevation of approximately 800 to 900 meters above sea level. On one side, it is sheltered by dense coniferous forests. On the other, mountain ranges protect the valley from harsh winds. The result is a mild climate, without intense summer heat or extreme winter cold. Physicians particularly valued the combination of three factors: clean air, moderate humidity, and mineral water. It was why patients were sent here after surgery, as well as those with respiratory, gastrointestinal, and metabolic disorders. That said, modern medicine emphasizes that the effectiveness of spa treatment depends on the specific condition, and medicinal mineral water should be consumed only on a doctor's recommendation. By the mid-20th century, Borjomi had become so popular that its summer population swelled several-fold. The central streets were bustling, brass bands played in the park, and dance floors, an open-air cinema, and numerous cafes thrived. If you look at archival photographs from the 1960s or 1970s, one detail stands out. People came to the springs carrying their own cups or small glass bottles. They filled them directly from the fountain taps and then strolled unhurriedly through the park just as they do today. This tradition has endured for nearly 2 centuries. But in the late 1980s, life in the town once again began to shift dramatically. The dissolution of the Soviet Union proved a severe trial for all of Georgia. In the early 1990s, the country faced economic collapse, power shortages, hyperinflation, and armed conflicts. Tourism practically ceased. Many sanatoriums closed, and some grand buildings fell into disrepair. Industry suffered particularly badly. Mineral water exports plummeted. Factories lost their traditional markets, and output fell several-fold. For a town whose economy had for decades relied heavily on the resort and the bottling plant, this was a devastating blow. Yet Borjomi managed to survive the crisis. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a gradual recovery began. Historic buildings were renovated, the famous Central Park was refurbished, bridges and promenades were restored. Private investment flowed in, and new hotels, cafes, and restaurants opened. Special attention was paid to preserving the region's natural heritage. In 1995, the Borjomi Karagali National Park was established, now one of the largest national parks in Europe. Spanning over 85,000 hectares, it covers roughly 1% of Georgia's total territory. It is home to brown bears, wolves, lynx, red deer, and dozens of rare bird species. Trails for visitors range from short walks to multi-day expeditions across mountain passes, pine forests, and alpine meadows. Remarkably, it was precisely the long absence of heavy industry that allowed many of the region's ecosystems to remain almost pristine. But nature reminds us of its power not only through beauty. In August 2008, during the armed conflict between Georgia and Russia, large-scale forest fires broke out around Borjomi. They destroyed hundreds of hectares of woodland and caused deep concern among environmentalists. Though much of the affected area has since been restored, the episode remains one of the national park's most severe trials. Today, Borjomi is once again among Georgia's most visited towns. People come not only for the famous water. They are drawn by the 19th century architecture, the forest trails, the historic mansions, the narrow-gauge railway to Bakurani Plateau, the cable car offering panoramic views of the gorge, and the chance to soak up the atmosphere of one of the Caucasus's most renowned resorts. And perhaps that is what makes Borjomi truly special. Over the course of its history, the town has changed many times. It has weathered wars, the fall of empires, revolutions, economic crises, and political upheavals. Yet each time, it has risen again as a place where people come in search of the same things they sought nearly 200 years ago: clean air, tranquility, nature, and the water that made this small town famous far beyond Georgia's borders. Today, Borjomi is not merely a resort or the birthplace of a famous mineral water. It is a small town in which different eras are traces of the Russian Empire, Soviet heritage, and a modern Georgia rediscovering its cultural and natural riches are woven together in a remarkable tapestry. Walking through the town center, this sense of time becomes almost palpable. On one side stand old wooden and stone buildings from the 19th century, surviving from the days when Russian aristocracy came here. On the other, Soviet-era sanatoriums with their characteristic modernist architecture. And all around, dense coniferous forests that appear not to have changed in hundreds of years. The heart of the town is Borjomi Central Park. It was created in the 19th century, when Prince Vorontsov first began developing the resort area around the mineral springs. Today, this remains the town's defining landmark. Here you will find the famous fountains where people come with bottles and cups, a habit that has scarcely changed in over a century. The water is the same as ever, warm, with its distinctive taste, rich in minerals and carbon dioxide. Interestingly, the temperature of the springs remains stable year-round, at around 3,840 degrees. So even in winter, you can see people drinking water outdoors, despite the cold air. Higher up in the park, one of the town's most recognizable attractions comes into view: the cable car, built in Soviet times. It connects the lower part of the park to the upper viewing platform. From above, the panorama of the entire Borjomi Gorge unfolds. The winding Kura River, rooftops, forests, and mountains stretching to the horizon. It is one of those places where you truly grasp the scale of the Caucasian landscape. Higher still are the fortresses of Gogia and Petre. Today, only ruins remain, but their positions still impress. They stand on opposite slopes of the gorge, as if still watching one another across the centuries. Once part of the region's defense network, they could relay signals by fire. Now they are quiet historical vantage points, offering some of the best views of the town. Near the center lies the Likhani Palace, another important symbol of Borjomi. Built for Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich Romanov and later used as a summer residence for the imperial family, the building is Moorish in style, making it unusual for the Caucasus. Today, it serves as an official residence and occasionally opens to visitors. Beside it stands the so-called Persian House, formerly the residence of the Persian consul Mirza Reza Khan. It is yet another reminder that Borjomi has always been a meeting place of cultures and diplomatic ties. Venturing beyond the town, a different Borjomi emerges, one of nature. The Borjomi Karagali National Park covers a vast area and is considered one of Europe's largest protected nature reserves. Here, you can walk for hours or even days along hiking trails without encountering a single town. Dense forests, mountain rivers, alpine meadows, and rare animals make this a unique place. Brown bears, lynx, wolves, and countless bird species live here. Yet the park remains accessible to visitors. Trails of varying difficulty allow everyone, from novices to seasoned trekkers, to experience the Caucasus. Another special feature of Borjomi is the narrow-gauge railway to Bakurani, known as the Kaku. This route was built in the early 20th century and is considered one of the most scenic in the region. The little train climbs slowly into the mountains, passing through forests, bridges, and gorges. The journey takes several hours, but for many tourists, it becomes an experience in itself well worth the trip to the region. Modern Borjomi is also a small but lively town. Hotels, cafes, small markets, souvenir shops, and family-run restaurants line its streets. In summer, the town fills with visitors. In winter, it becomes quiet and calm, returning to a slower, more measured rhythm. Yet what remains unchanged is the feeling of place. Borjomi does not try to be a metropolis or a modern tourist center in the conventional sense. It remains a town existing in its own time, where history is not separate from daily life but woven into the streets, buildings, and landscapes. And perhaps this is why people keep coming back. Not just for the water or the nature, but for a sense of peace that is hard to find in big cities. Borjomi is not just a dot on the map of Georgia. It is a place where nature and history have coexisted for thousands of years, where ancient springs, medieval fortresses, imperial residences, and Soviet sanatoriums form a single, living layer of time. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about this town is that it never became a museum. It continues to live.